History can be categorized into three parts: history that happened, history that did not happen, and history that might have happened. Today, I am going to speak on a topic that puts all three together. The United States, from its own propaganda machine, often bills itself as the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. And indeed, it does have the pedigree to back up this claim. But what if I told you that it has arrived to its current position in great part to a few seemingly unconnected world events, and two of them happened in the Caribbean? I am going to focus on one of them today, but before I do, I need to give some background, and that background takes us back to the year 711 on the Iberian Peninsula, which is today occupied by the nations of Spain and Portugal. In the year 711, Muslim Berbers, also known as Moors, crossed from North Africa into the Christian-dominated Iberian Peninsula and waged a 7-year war on the local population and took control, primarily the southern portion of the peninsula. This era began the Muslim domination of the area that would last up until 1492. Of those roughly 700 years, 400 of them saw a golden age of remarkable stability and prosperity. The period also brought Muslims, Christians, and Jews together under one rule, sparking a symbiotic relationship between all three as they all benefited from one another. The Jews, however, were the driving force behind the economy of this golden age. They were the merchants and essentially the bankers, as they were often prevented from holding other positions. Their skill with money would of course become a signature of Jewish culture and go on to play a huge role in the later developments I will mention later in this video. Starting in the early 1100s, things began to change as the Christian population began to agitate against Muslim rule, striking blows to their rule. However, the writing on the wall came in the year 1469 when two powerful northern regions of the peninsula, Castile and Aragon, joined together through the marriage union of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. This brought together their combined forces and a formidable Christian army designed to expel the Moors from the region. Their union also laid the foundation of what would become known as the Kingdom of Spain. So on January 2nd, 1492, the joint forces of Ferdinand and Isabella conquered the Moor stronghold in Granada in the south, which for all intents and purposes brought Muslim rule to an end and ushering in an age of Christian nationalism. Over the next 15 years, all non-Christians under their control were forcibly converted to Christianity. Non-Jews who converted were called Moriscos, and Jews who converted were called Marranos. Not only were Jews forced to convert, on March 31st of 1492, all Jews who refused to convert were ordered to leave the land, 40,000 in total. This seemed rather odd because it was evident the Jewish presence played a huge role in the economic success of the region. But within the court of Ferdinand and Isabella was a fanatical Dominican friar by the name of Tomás de Torquemada, who became the head of the horrific Inquisition that was set up to root out, torture, punish, or kill all non-Catholic peoples with special focus on Jews pretending to be Christians. It can be deduced that Torquemada sought to have the Jews removed in order to gain access to their wealth. In fact, one of the crimes the Inquisition was set up to deal with was usury, which is money lending at high interest rates, which was a domain of many Jews, and perhaps many Christians were indebted to Jewish lenders. Of note, is that on October 3rd, 1492, the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas for Spain under the patronage of Ferdinand and Isabella. His mission was in part sparked by the sea successes of the neighboring Portuguese, who by the time of his departure from Spain had already made successful voyages down the western coast of Africa and beyond, in the process engaging in trading for enslaved Africans and bringing them back to Portugal. This began what has become known as the Age of Exploration and the eventual European involvement in the African slave trade. Columbus's successful navigation to the Americas would, of course, open the door to the African slave trade, becoming a crucial path to Western European wealth and eventual world domination. History begets history. When Spain expelled the Jews in 1492, many fled to nearby Portugal, where initially they found asylum in return for payment. However, with Spain's growing power and the Inquisition's reach, pressure was placed on the Portuguese monarchy to expel the Jews from their kingdom too. So in 1497, King Manuel I decreed that all unconverted Jews were to leave the Kingdom of Portugal. Many of these Jews ended up in what is Holland, or the Netherlands today, which at the time was under Spanish control, though this was a rather uneasy control. Spain was Catholic, while the Dutch in the Netherlands were Protestants. This created growing tensions between the ruling Spanish and their Dutch subjects, and would eventually lead to a revolt by the Dutch. Other Jews fled to the newly discovered land of Brazil, which fell under the control of the Portuguese by papal decree. By 1500, the Portuguese had arrived there and began setting up shop. The Jews who fled to Holland settled in Amsterdam, primarily because other Dutch towns and cities were not as welcoming. The Dutch in Amsterdam were no fools and recognized the beneficial skill set of the Jewish refugees, and unlike in Spain and Portugal, extended religious freedoms and tolerance to them. In short time, Amsterdam was exponentially transformed into a financial capital and served as a central location for Jewish networks across Europe, Asia, and over into the newly discovered lands in the Americas, underwriting explorations, the setting up of colonies, and helping other Jews in these areas. These were all under the blessings of Dutch elites who encouraged many of these Jews to be the guinea pigs, if you will, in the New World explorations and settlements. The Dutch eventually muscled in on Portuguese territory in Brazil in 1630 by creating a colony in the northeastern section of the area. Jews and Jewish financing played a pivotal role in creating the colony and sustaining it. In addition, the Jews there, and back in Amsterdam, engaged in slave trading, helping to bring the free labor of enslaved Africans to the colony. The Jews also became masters of sugar cultivating, a product that had come to Brazil from the Portuguese island of Madeira off the northwestern coast of Africa. The sugarcane and the enslaved African would become indelibly linked in the annals of South American and Caribbean history. History begets history. The Dutch colony, headquartered in Recife, was such a success, even the Portuguese living there came to benefit from its success, where many of them eventually found themselves in debt to Jewish financiers. That and other issues and concerns led the Portuguese to rise up in an attempt to take back their possession. So in 1864, they successfully recaptured the land from the Dutch and drove them out of the area. Among them were the Jews who fled to places like Curaçao, a Dutch possession, Dutch Guyana, today's Suriname, the land areas of what is today's Guyana, New Amsterdam, which would eventually become New York City, and the island of Barbados. Barbados at the time had come under British control, and early pioneers to the island like James Drax had begun to experiment with sugar cane cultivation on the island based on knowledge he gained about the crop while on a visit to Recife in Brazil in 1640. While at the time enslaved Africans and banished Irish were already on the island serving as slaves, it was Drax's successful experimentation of sugar production and the eventual need for a labor force to grow it, harvest it, and produce products from it that led to the huge drive to begin importing even more enslaved Africans to the island and eventually throughout the Caribbean. History begets history. One other place Jews fleeing from the former Dutch colony in Brazil fled to was a tiny, seemingly insignificant 8 square mile Dutch island in the northeastern Caribbean known as St. Eustatius. Before they arrived, there were already a few Jews living there, but things were about to quickly change for the fortunes of this tiny island. The Dutch set up St. Eustatius as a free port. In addition, the Dutch categorized themselves as neutral when it came to the various wars between the other competing European colonial powers, notably England, France, Spain, and Portugal. In the rules of war, a neutral country, remained neutral and was to be off limits to attack. With this benefit on their side, the Dutch maximized the potential and set up St. Eustatius as a, shall we say, Mall of the Americas, where even European enemies could come and shop together. By the mid-1700s, the harbor's seashore was packed with warehouses on every inch of it, packed with goods from all over the colonized world. Hundreds of ships bringing in and carrying away goods filled the harbor. The commercial success of the island gained the moniker the Golden Rock, and the Jews, numbering 101 families at the time, on the island, led and oversaw the prominence of the island. Not only were ships coming from Europe, South America, and Africa, they were also coming from the new British American colonies along the American coastline, and this would prove extremely beneficial and important in the years to come. In 1754, war broke out between England and France over who had rights to the American heartland. The war ended in 1763, with England emerging victorious but at a heavy cost. To cover the cost, King George of England imposed heavy taxes on his American colonists without their consent. This led to discontent, leading up to the British Crown even blocking trade between its American colonies and other European powers, notably their enemies, France and Spain, and to an extent Holland. Trade was only allowed between them and England. To ensure this, the British patrolled the shipping lanes out of Europe to prevent goods and supplies from reaching the colonies from other European countries. So when war between the American colonies and England broke out in April of 1785, England held the advantage by preventing supplies from reaching the rebellious colonies. Enter St. Eustatius. As mentioned earlier, the American colonies had been engaged in trade and supply purchasing from St. Eustatius prior to the outbreak of war with England, and St. Eustatius would become a lifeline to the colonies. Eventually, war supplies, munitions, and even correspondences to and from Europe began making their way to and through St. Eustatius and onto the American mainland or back to Europe, essentially sustaining American resistance to England. With money being made, munitions and weapons were even coming from England, to the point where British soldiers later lamented they were facing their own weapons in the war. France and Spain, seeing an opportunity to weaken their rival, also used St. Eustatius to assist the rebellious colonies, while France used nearby Martinique as a secondary site to undermine England's reach into the Americas. England was aware of what was going on in St. Eustatius, but with the island being Dutch and supposedly neutral, the rules of war prevented England from attacking. England became even more furious with the happenings in St. Eustatius when an American ship, the Andrea Doria, arrived in the harbor at St. Eustatius to pick up supplies and gunpowder. while also delivering a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and it was greeted with an 11-gun salute acknowledging the validity of the newly declared nation of the United States, the first place on earth to do so. Eventually, England declared war on the Netherlands in 1780, primarily because of the activities in St. Eustatius, essentially fighting two wars simultaneously, while France and Spain worked behind the scenes to weaken their rival. Before the declaration of the war, however, England had already outfitted a naval fleet to head to St. Eustatius and deal with what they called a nest of vipers. Tapped to lead this fleet was General John Vaughan and Admiral George Rodney. The fleet sailed out of British St. Lucia on July 30th, 1781, and arrived 4 days later in the Fort Orange harbor at St. Eustatius, carrying 3,000 troops. Some ships were dispatched to keep an eye on the French in nearby Martinique. The island surrendered without a fight, and Admiral Rodney went on to plunder the island, and taking special care to punish the Jewish population there. His writings indicate that he had reserved a special hatred for the Jews, and his actions toward them indicate as much. He exiled some to nearby British St. Kitts. He locked up others. He robbed them of all their possessions, even desecrating Jewish graves to search for money and valuables, as well as cutting open their clothing where he believed they were also hiding money. While he allowed others, like French, Dutch, and British citizens on the island to leave with their possessions, he ordered all remaining Jews off the island within 24 hours, and they had to also leave their possessions behind. In addition, he burned down the warehouses after looting them. Some of those Jews moved to the then Danish island of St. Thomas and founded a synagogue there, and went on to lead that island to becoming a success for Denmark. Rodney was given specific orders to simply destroy the illicit trade on the island and await orders to move onto the American mainland to provide backup and cover for British troops fighting the American colonists. But his impassioned hatred for the Jews and greed obsessed and deterred him, and what should have taken a few days or even a month extended to 6 months on the island. This was critical because while Rodney was distracted at St. Eustatius, a French fleet led by General Comte de Grasse sailed out of Martinique on the way to Chesapeake Bay in the Maryland-Virginia area to assist General George Washington, leader of the American troops. Rodney was aware of the French fleet, but paid little attention to it, deciding instead to send some of his ships back to England to carry the loot from St. Eustatius. So the French fleet moved on unimpeded. When the French fleet arrived at Chesapeake Bay, they found the British general, Cornwallis, holed up in the town of Yorktown with George Washington in pursuit. He was awaiting reinforcement and backup from British ships. None arrived, because the British Navy headed them off in the bay, and Rodney never showed up with his fleet. Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender, and for all intents and purposes the war was over, and England lost its American colonies. Rodney returned to England in poor health and was lambasted for his major gaffe, and barely escaping being removed from his position. However, in February of 1782, he was back in the Caribbean, and by April of that year, he would emerge as a hero and the man responsible for saving the English presence in the Caribbean. In addition, he would get his revenge. This will be discussed in the next video, so stay tuned.